Okay, it's episode 2 time. I'm pumped. We got old Jimmy, we got a brand new movie, plenty to talk about. Okay, so here's the thing. I spent a lot of time on that first video, and by the 9th rewatch and with all the editing, I still don't think it's very good. Now, is that my fault?
You see this? Holy This is not your fault.
Or is it the subject matter, which I chose and also makes it my fault?
Unfortunately, I misjudged you. You are just a stupid.
I guess at this point it's not important, but I found myself wanting to talk about something that is, in my eyes anyway, more quote-unquote historical. Maybe that's the way it is. You spend a lot of time on something, and it can never be as good as you really want it to be. At the time, I thought I could expand on the author and lay the foundations for the series, both the James Bond one and my own, which I believe are now equal in terms of profitability and positive reviews. But whether or not that came across in the close to 2 hours of rambling remains to be seen. Maybe I should have learned to emote more, or change up my monotone monstrosity of a voice, or maybe it was too many cutaways. I don't know. I do know I wanted to cover more, but it's impossible really. I didn't want to read out his biography line by line. But now though, for this topic, it seems like my eyes may be too big for my historical stomach per se, since my topic for this video, as seen when you started it, is the Cold War. A pretty unique type of conflict overall. It lasted for over 4 decades, from just after the Second World War until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. It's more remembered for the battles that weren't fought than for the battles that were. We'll see that that's not entirely accurate, since that makes it seem like there was no violence at all. And there was plenty. Exact dates for wars are often based on a perceived starting point, like a major battle or something. But there were moments that led to that battle that can be forgotten in the meantime. I know I may sound confident when I say this kind of stuff.
As you perfectly well know, I have absolute confidence in you, and
That's what kept me going, chef.
But rest assured, there's a lot of uncertainty going on here. I also know that basically every conflict or war is unique in its own way. But if I have to keep stopping to explain all of my less than reputable claims, we'll never get out of here.
Do you realize how absurd your position is?
No more absurd than starting a
historical series concerning the James Bond films.
So obviously I can't cover everything that took place throughout the entirety of the Cold War, or we'd be here for way longer than anyone wants to hear my voice. There are plenty of books and series that try to cover it, and the problem with trying to cover everything is that you can't. You just can't.
Well, we can't all be geniuses, can we?
There's no way that one book or one documentary can cover every single aspect of something like the Cold War. What I will try to do is get into some of the background that led up to the period, as well as some of the particular trends that stand out to me. There's just no way to be all-inclusive here. As much as I'd like to talk about how both the United States and the Soviet Union developed plans that involved nuking the moon, or how an alien attack would have brought the world together in a real-life Independence Day, there's too much to consider, and if I try to cover it all, then nothing will be given enough space to be properly contextualized or understood, at least to the best of my limited abilities. All you have to do is imagine that every day during the Cold War was a new adventure, with nuclear annihilation always sitting in the back of people's minds.
The immediate danger is over in about a minute.
What? Native superstition.
And since you can always count on people to be completely rational, I was very surprised to find out that people could be kind of heated and angry during this period. Weird. Regardless, there is a wealth of stuff to talk about, so if I didn't cover something that you knew about, be sure to mention what an idiot I am, and how that moment was the most important and define the era or whatever, blah blah blah. Intercut throughout all of this will be a look into From Russia with Love, the second James Bond film, and one that I believe exemplifies a Cold War worldview made into film. It had been 1 year since the last one, and the public needed more Bond. apparently.
Only the second James Bond thriller could be more exciting than the first.
Jack?
Everything is ramped up here, but still kind of within the realm of possibility. Not so much like yeah, I can imagine myself doing that. This movie is still kind of like the book written by our favorite monogamous Cold Warrior Ian Fleming, but with some notable differences. Again, we see the fake Spectre instead of the real Smersh as the evil organization pulling the strings in the background, an international force of villainy instead of a purely Soviet one. Using Spectre instead of Smersh was a way of avoiding some of the political issues that would come with calling out the Soviets too much, as if the title wasn't enough. A lot of other plot points coincide, but this major change in terms of nefarious organizations actually changes the movie's overall message to the audience. Sure, the Soviet Union may be evil, but they aren't the most evilest? And since this film is a direct response to the previous one, the death of Dr. No at the hands of Bond comes back into play, which is kind of a rarity in Bond films. The book also had a major cliffhanger ending, one where the fate of James Bond is left uncertain. Will the movie follow suit?
Remove his suit and search him.
Stay tuned to find out on Bonding with History Episode 2. The Cold War, a love story. A From Russia with Love story. Hey, that's clever. Come on. So the makers of Dr. No are back for round 2. And I'm not even kidding, it's basically the same team that made the last film. Same producers, director, writer, cinematographer, editor, and of course the same star, Sean Connery, the height of masculine energy.
I like the way he moved, and the fact that he had a lot of acting experience. But he moves extremely well.
Since the first one was such a surprising smash hit, bringing back the people who made it what it was only makes sense. For all of its issues, Dr. No really did work out for them, and the actor-director combo is one of the big reasons developing Bond into the character he is.
Its real style and the movement of the piece was Terence Young stamped all over it.
If you asked what were the 3 ingredients for Dr. No, for James Bond, it was Sean Connery, Sean Connery, and Sean Connery.
They were missing the set designer, Ken Adam, who did a pretty good job overall, especially with Dr. No's study and dining room, as well as the nuclear facility. After Dr. No, Adam had chosen to work on Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove instead, showing that movies needed to have a PhD if they wanted to retain his services. Pretty well-regarded film though, not a bad choice. The guy who designed the opening titles and came up with the gun barrel sequence, Maurice Binder, also wasn't there, and neither was our favorite stunt double, Bob Simmons. But they pressed on with the majority. And, in terms of the book they chose to put into film, it had come out in a 1961 Life magazine article that US President John F. Kennedy had included Ian Fleming's From Russia with Love on his list of top 10 novels. So they decided to jump on that publicity, betting on the president's popularity to help sell the film and the budding franchise.
I would like to take this opportunity to express my fondness for
From Russia with Love.
I'd also like to express my fondness for that particular
book.
A man never
liked Bond
in his life.
Especially in the United States. Remember, even though Dr. No was a success, it was still much more centered in Britain than the US. Making JFK's list was no doubt a highlight for Fleming, even though the rest of the books on the list were also really focused on British men. but admittedly from more of a statesman angle. Books about old dead white dudes will always sell well. In terms of their publication order, the novel, From Russia with Love, was the 5th book released, with Dr. No being the 6th, meaning they were already going backwards and the film series plots don't track in the books at all, but we already knew all that. I must have mentioned it 40 times by now. The important thing to remember is that Fleming wrote his books with a specific view of the world, one that was completely based around a Cold War mentality. Even though the movies were much less politically or even ideologically motivated than the books, it does translate into the films at times, and especially in this one.
You did say your clock was correct.
Russian clocks are always correct.
And you really see it more when you know to look for it. But seriously, the first time I saw this movie, I was so bored. It lacked all the non-stop action that the Pierce Brosnan movies had, the ones that I watched when I was growing up.
No! Give me the cards, Natalia! Give them to me!
But after getting a bit older, maybe maturing a little bit, not a lot, mind you, just a little, I can really appreciate it for what it is. Time truly heals all cinematic wounds. In the build-up for this one, a lot of the posters show Sean Connery with this kind of long-barreled gun that we never see him use on screen, very different from his Walther PPK. Turns out that this happened because someone forgot the actual gun back at the office during the photo shoot, and the photographer just happened to have an air pistol in his car. And they also didn't Photoshop, or whatever the 1960s equivalent of Photoshop was, the long barrel off, so we're left with pictures of Bond with a gun that he never uses. But just don't question it. I know you can't make this stuff up. Really, even this little story just kind of encapsulates all the problems that happened during the shooting of this film. But I guess it does make the poster pop. Maybe more so than if you had the classic Walther PPK, even if it's way too big for a secret agent in the field. But maybe Bond could hide it.
In a lady's handbag?
Who knows? Alright, so let's go. The movie starts and Spectre is angry. They're like a petulant teenager at the height of their sullen moodiness, and the target of their anger is none other than James Bond. Apparently, him killing Dr. No was a bit of a problem for them.
I think that Spectre will probably have the chance of a personal revenge for the killing of our operative, Dr. No. Because the man the British will almost certainly use on a mission of this sort would be their agent, James Bond.
Probably not least because Bond had no idea what Spectre was before Dr. No flat out told him.
I'm a member of Spectre.
Spectre?
Spectre.
Spectre?
Spectre.
Spectre?
Spectre.
Actually, like I was saying, just including a reference to a previous film in the series is kind of an outlier. Sure, the series has times where they mention things that come up in past movies.
This never happened to the other fella.
More so once Daniel Craig took the role and it became one giant interwoven story. But for the most part, each individual film can be seen without needing to have seen the others, like some sort of Bond vacuum. And even though Spectre exists in a bunch of the films, they don't usually mention specifics about how Bond defeated them in the past. Probably because they don't want to focus too much on how one guy keeps beating them. But I digress. The film actually does open on Bond this time, as he walks through a garden, obviously being followed by a guy hardly trying to hide himself. After what feels like hours, and going through what can barely be called cat and mouse-like tension, Bond is strangled by this unnamed villain. And then the final credits roll. Wow, killing off the main character in the first few minutes, what a bold choice. They can join such other great works as... Just beautiful. I guess Spectre got their revenge and we can all go home. Anyway, that aside, the lights come back on and it turns out that these two were just putting on a show for an audience besides us. And it wasn't even real Bond at all, it was just some guy in a mask. A very convincing mask, mind you. The eyes especially are very well done. So apparently this blonde guy passed some sort of test by murdering this trick-or-treating adult. I don't want to harp on this too much, but think about it. Did this guy volunteer for the job? Put on this tuxedo and mask, then walk around in the garden until you die type of thing? I know they're an evil organization, but it seems even a bit too theatrical for them. Like, what? It doesn't make any sense. I'm not a fan of things that are done purely for the benefit of the audience, like when a killer is seen behind someone in the shadows but then disappears before they're seen by the characters, so it's meant to scare us as an audience more than anything else. Anyway, this kind of falls into that category. I'm not sure what strangling some guy with no peripheral vision proves in terms of someone's ability as an assassin, but apparently he did a good job. I really want to know though, did this guy have a say? Did he get to choose? He's like, can I do it without the mask? Can we just like fight it out? No, he lost the coin toss and had to wear a mask. Why was he wearing a mask?
No one cared who I was till I put on the mask.
Anyway, we're off and running. Apparently this guy is the one who will finally take down James Bond, even though James Bond probably won't be wearing a James Bond mask when they fight. Also, James Bond apparently deserves this much credit, even though he's only been in one other movie, and can apparently be put back on desk duty pretty quickly.
Unless, of course, you prefer to go back to standard intelligence duties.
No, sir.
Plus, if you bothered to watch my last video, then we know about the luck that got him to where he is. Luck and the stupidity of others. I bet that won't come back into play. So we move on to the opening titles, and they're closer to what we'll come to expect from a Bond movie, as opposed to the more, let's say, experimental Dr. No. Kind of a direct approach here, with the silhouettes and such. Still no song with the movie title yet, but give them time. They're learning. Then there's an interesting choice with including this opening chess match at all. Since that's not really what you consider as a Bond staple, alongside fast cars, loose women, and unquestionable moral absolutism. Besides being an obvious analogy to the plot of the movie, i.e. Spectre moving around the pieces on a chessboard, the brilliant coup that they describe that gets this gaunt-faced man the win is taken from a real match in which Boris Spassky defeated David Bronstein in the 1960 USSR Championships.
Congratulations, sir. A brilliant coup.
Now, I don't know if there was some higher significance in using a chess move that, at the time, was just made famous in the Soviet Union, but obviously they did do this move on purpose. It's also worth pointing out that Spassky actually didn't win the overall tournament, so do with that what you will. You might think it's a weird decision to have this in the movie at all, but it becomes even weirder when you find out that the set cost more than $150,000. For a scene that's 2.5 minutes long. Sure, the budget for the movie may have doubled, but now they're just tossing money around. I mean, it's a nice set, don't get me wrong. But it could have just been in any room, right? Like any room. Maybe this one, or this one. This one's nice. This one too. See, any room could have worked. And just to be clear, if only because it popped into my head when I was rewatching it, the chess moves played here are not the same as the ones they included in Spectre, which would premiere 52 years after this one came out. I was hoping that it would, for fanboy purposes, but we can't have everything. Another big change in this movie, besides the wanton spending, is that the mystery element is gone, at least for us as an audience. If you remember Dr. No, there was some mystery to it, right? We didn't know exactly who this guy was, and we had a basic idea of the plot, but it wasn't expansive. So there was something that we needed to find out at the end of the movie, that it all led to.
But there are so many files open on you already, Dr. No.
In From Russia with Love, the filmmakers were instead more worried about the plot being too complicated. And that might be why they included a scene where the bad guys, Spectre, completely explain their plan and what they're going to do for the rest of the movie. It's like when you had to write an essay in high school, and your intro is supposed to lay out all of your major arguments for the rest of the paper in a sequence. First, I'm going to say this. Second, I'm going to say that. I get that it's necessary in some respects, like writing an essay, but I didn't think it needed to be translated to film. So overall, it means that while Bond is perpetually confused as to what's going on, we're not. We're all seeing, we're all knowing, we're omniscient, we're God. I'm sorry about that. But since this was actually a real concern that they had, audiences not being able to follow what's going on throughout the movie, the director and the editor made changes on the fly in order to make it more obvious, shifting scenes to make more sense and lay everything out. And we as a stupid audience do so appreciate their efforts. So here's the plan in case you weren't following. Spectre wanted to manipulate the British to steal a decoding machine called a lector from the Russians, then in turn steal it from the British and sell it back to the Russians. Oh, and kill Bond for killing Dr. No. The success of this plan completely depends on the British choosing to get involved even though it's obviously a trap.
Well, obviously it's a trap.
But I guess we can always depend on that, or else the movie would be over.
Kronstein, you are sure this plan is foolproof?
Yes, it is. Because I have anticipated every possible variation of counter-move.
So it's all in a day's work. Seemingly convoluted, yet laid out for us on a platter. Honestly, one of the most fascinating parts of this is actually considering the dynamics of Spectre as an organization. Our villainess, the Russian Rosa Klebb, is now the new Spectre number 3. She's the one who has to set up the personnel for the scheme thought up by our Czechoslovakian chess player, Tov Kronstein, who's Spectre number 5. All of this is at the behest of Blofeld.
Ernst von Blofeld.
In terms of Klebb though, apparently Spectre brought her over from Smersh, and her defection from the Soviet Union is not known to many.
It is most unlikely she would know I'm now working for Spectre.
Yeah, I just said that.
Moscow has kept my defection secret from everyone but a few members of the Presidium.
Anyway, they do love their secrets, those Soviets. Defections were a Cold War staple too, but that's a story for another day. I don't want to get into too much here. It's kind of confusing, this whole structure. They're an evil group, sure, but they still have to draft talent like a sports organization? So they bring in the free agent Rosa Klebb and put her right into the starting lineup at number 3. Whereas this other guy, Kronstein, who was presumably already there, is stuck at number 5. She must be a prime free agent to merit such an offer from such a prestigious organization.
Spectre.
I can't find any mention of a number designation for Dr. No at all, so maybe he was just some guy that let tag along, like somebody's little brother. But apparently his death actually warrants a response. So Klebb has her job, and she pays a visit to Spectre Island, and trades some truly horrible dub dialogue.
Where is he now?
At the lake. Bring him to my office, will you?
Take me to the lake.
Through the training area.
Where is he now?
At the lake. Bring him to my office, will you?
Take me to the lake.
Through the training area. Through the training area. Through the training area.
Oh, not this mess again. I complain about this every time. Anyway, Spectre Island. The place where they train the world's greatest assassins by having them all shoot at a random target while other people practice karate or judo in the background. And other people kill people in masks in a garden. Makes sense to me. This editing, I tell you, it does not stand up to my nitpicking like 60 years later. Now, our blonde friend is shown, and he is very much set up as an evil version of Bond. Because Bond is such a picture-perfect good guy.
For England, James? No. For me.
So I guess the application process had several steps. Killing a guy with a Bond mask, step 1, boom, done, over. And step 2 is getting sucker punched by some old lady.
He seems fit enough.
Oh, and that's it. Well, if it's good enough for Spectre, it's good enough for me. He's introduced as Donald Red Grant, a homicidal paranoiac. And that description pretty much applies to Bond as well. Seems like Spectre and the British government choose applicants from the same pool. Interestingly enough though, he is one of the better villains that I can remember for Bond. Someone who's actually kind of an equal. And then we're introduced to the Bond girl, Tatiana Romanova. Well, if you thought the second Bond movie would flesh out the character of the Bond girl more than the first, you're way off. You're so far off, it's laughable. Daniela Bianchi, whose name I hope I'm not massacring, another model turned actress, has almost less of a character than Honey Rider. If we're talking about someone being used and having no personal agency, Tatiana is used by the British, through Bond, and Spectre, through Klebb. And there's barely any time devoted to her own development. And get ready for the dubbing. More dubbing. I mean, they all knew they were going to dub over this girl before her first scene was even shot, but still, it's pretty blatant sometimes.
I see you trained for the ballet.
But I grew an inch over the regulation height, and so. But I grew an inch over the regulation height, and so. But I grew an inch over the regulation height.
But anyway, here's Klebb, still pretending to be part of Smersh, but actually part of Spectre, demanding that Tatiana, a loyal Russian, seduce Bond in order to give false information to the enemy.
Its purpose is to give false information to the enemy.
That's it, that's the quote. That's all the info you're gonna get. Now go put on a mask and head out to the gardens. There's some real sexual vibes here. Definitely one-sided, but still present, and they were considered risque at the time, but also harkening back to Ian Fleming's inclusion of angry lesbians that hate men, in terms of Klebb's character, of course. Tatiana is presented as more of a naive girl, even though she has no real way of knowing she's going to be used like this.
Come, come, my dear. Come, come, my dear. Come, come, my dear. Come, come, my dear.
The most interesting part of the scene isn't the sexuality, though. It's the submissiveness to authority in terms of how Tatiana just agrees to a potentially deadly espionage mission, despite just being a clerk, and not a spy. At least who I think is a clerk. I mean, she works with the decoding machine, but does she have any training for this kind of undercover mission? It really speaks to the power that Soviet officials held over regular people, and the knowledge of what happens if you disobey. And now I'm not saying there isn't a misuse of power all over the place in capitalist countries too, but for it to be so ingrained in people is a different matter. I know I wouldn't blindly agree to some mission if some person claiming to be a military authority told me to.
You are not here to ask questions. You forget to whom you're speaking.
That's not important. Don't ask me questions. I'm not taking questions. The Golden God is not taking questions.
That's the sign of someone who is aware of the consequences of saying no. She's probably seen it happen before. So it's not necessarily subtle, but it's a good indication of the dynamics between these two, and a way to jab at the Soviets in a slightly more subtle way.
I will say nothing to anyone.
If you do, you will be shot.
Not a lot of James Bond in this James Bond movie, huh? All this time I've spent, I haven't even gotten to the real one yet. And if you thought it took a while to get to him in the last movie, it's got nothing on this one. This movie is over 15% done at this point, and all we've seen is the amazing prosthetics department that Spectre has going. Well, now the setup is complete, so we need that payoff. And here he is. Oh, with a familiar face. Okay, time to move on. But I am being serious when I say that we're moving on, for the plot and for Sylvia Trench, since this will be the last time we see her. This actress was supposed to play Bond's home girlfriend for a few more movies, and he was always supposed to get called away just before, and I'm quoting the Bond wiki here, things get interesting. At the same time though, we know he's going to have sex with her, compromising national security in the process, since he puts off going to work. So that inclusion really doesn't make sense to me, but that's besides the point. But they got rid of the idea of having a home girlfriend after this one, because tying Bond down to one woman would be too much of a break in his character. Or actually, maybe having her wait around for him was just too demeaning. I'm just kidding. There's no chance of that.
Tell him I'm on my way, will you?
He is not on his way.
Sylvia, behave. We'll do this again some other time soon.
I don't really know why her little character arc was scrapped after 2 movies, but I guess it doesn't really matter now. Bond's free from anything that could be considered commitment, and it's about time because now the movie can really begin. and since I love to subvert expectations, and we're past the preamble, let's move on to a different section. Why was Spectre so certain that their plan of divide and conquer would work? Well, we need to understand that plan through the lens of a Cold War mentality, based on how Spectre itself understands that divide.
East, west, just points of the compass, each as stupid as the other.
Remember that? You don't have to see it through that lens, of course, but that's how I do. So there. First things first, I'm going to use the blanket term of capitalist and communist a lot. And I want to point out that those terms are not the only ways to frame the Cold War, even though they were the prominent ideologies of the era. Really, it went beyond economics to cover systems of governance and control, as well as how they maintained power, and how their respective citizens internalized their beliefs. As always, it's more complicated than this side is only one thing, and this side is only another thing. And while I don't want to oversimplify the ideological power dynamics of the period, I will almost certainly be doing exactly that. So with that done, how do we consider the Cold War, which basically affected the entire world for decades? Well, the easiest way to explain for me was always with this helpful little rhyme. East versus West, let's see who's best. While that simplifies the Cold War to an almost blasphemous degree, it can set up what I really want to talk about. But first, why is it called the Cold War? What is a Cold War? Wars can be named for any number of reasons, like the year it started. The sides that were involved, where it happened, or really any reason you can think of. Sometimes names just stick. So is the Cold War just a cool name like the Pastry War, the Emu War, or World War I? Or is there some meaning there? Well, as you might have guessed from yet another obvious setup, it's the latter. It was called the Cold War because there wasn't really an open conflict with armies between the major belligerents. Wars where there are actual armed battles are considered hot wars, or most of the time just wars. And the Cold War as a whole was more like a stewing of grievances and non-stop tensions that lasted a fair amount of time. That's one of the reasons why James Bond and the idea of spying in general could become so popular during this period, since it wasn't so much about soldiers and battles that they won or lost as it was about clandestine cloak and dagger kind of espionage. Information and the control of it was the name of the game. Of course, as we all know, there were obviously spies before the Cold War, but they usually fell second to some battle or another. Look at World War II, spying was a major focus for all parties, but we think more of the Normandy invasions or Operation Barbarossa than we do about the activities of Juan Pujol Garcia, whose name I definitely just butchered, despite his successes as a double agent working for the British. Sure, they may have been absolutely crucial to victory, but there were still large-scale open battles between the armies that were involved. Now, if the Cold War as a whole was the backdrop for decades of unrest, that doesn't mean that actual armed conflicts didn't occur during the period, or as a direct result of it, with the most powerful nations supporting in the background, while the others did the fighting and the dying. Here are some of the better known ones: the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, the Cuban Revolution, the Six-Day War, the Soviet-Afghan War, and a whole hell of a lot of invasions and coups d'etats and what have you. Oh yeah, a little thing you might have heard of called Vietnam. So big open armed conflicts between nations and people did happen, but not directly between the United States and the Soviet Union. They never invaded each other, and they were the superpowers behind it all. However, for a lot of countries, the Cold War was an overarching basis for a lot of the decisions that were made on national and international levels. Well, most of the wars that I talked about usually ended. There was always this specter,
Spectre?
Spectrum.
excuse the word choice, of a looming global war between the United States and the Soviet Union. One that, if it unleashed its destructive nuclear potential, would likely end all life on Earth as we know it. Mutually assured destruction is as scary as it sounds, and the idea was that if one side wanted to actually attack, the other would respond, and the result would be some kind of complete and total devastation type deal. The threat of violence acting as a countermeasure to actual violence. It's like if you and this kid from across the street that you used to hang out with for a bit both wanted the same, let's say, I don't know, what example would make sense? Chocolate bar, frisbee, worldwide geopolitical dominance, any of the above really. Sure, you used to be friends, you even fought that nasty German kid together. Or was he Austrian? But that was in the past. And since you're both tough guys, neither side would probably win if you actually fought over this chocolate bar, frisbee, worldwide geopolitical dominance. So you both kind of just sit there, making your other, not as strong friends fight instead, while staying out of it. But not really. Is this metaphor tracking here? I don't think so. I may have lost it somewhere. Now, I won't say that every major global issue from the end of World War II until the fall of the Soviet Union was done as a reaction to the Cold War tensions and concerns. Definitely not. But it certainly affected a lot of the changes and choices throughout the second half of the 20th century. So, as with most widespread international strife, the Cold War has its humble beginnings long before the date we consider it to really have started. And when I say that it lasted around 4 decades, I'm oversimplifying it, since the underlying tensions grew and festered long before the official starting date, and continued long after it supposedly ended. Just because a peace accord is signed or a new leader is installed doesn't magically erase all the problems that existed before, no matter how much new governments would like that to be the case. So before we look at the background, let's look at the parties involved. At the end of the Second World War, there were pretty much 3 superpowers: the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain. However, as we've seen was one of the reasons that Ian Fleming wrote his books in the first place, Britain was quickly losing its prominence in world affairs after the war. They were never gone completely, but they were hardly the same as they were. Post-war rebuilding and decolonization efforts took away a lot of their international reach, eventually stripping them of the superpower status in the eyes of the world, leaving only 2. I want to save the topic of decolonization for another episode because there's a lot to talk about, and I haven't read nearly enough on it yet. But suffice to say, it was not a simple process. So we kick Britain out of the superpowers club, and we got the United States and the Soviet Union.
Sorry, not you.
Britain.
Why not?
Has anything like this opposition of 2 forces ever happened before? There are historical comparisons that can and have been made, such as rivalries between England and Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries, and it's similar in the sense that the world was pulled into conflict. Although this example had a religious basis to it that was markedly different from the economic and social systems at play during the Cold War we all know and love. There was also a lot more direct conflict between England and Spain. And, oh yeah, there wasn't to worry about literally ending all life on the planet. Between our 2 20th century superpowers, I would say that everyone knows about the United States. But since its dissolution, maybe the Soviet Union is a bit less known. So here's a quick recap. The Soviet Union's full name is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is exactly what it claims to be. A bunch of republics that are kind of in a union centered around the ideals of socialism in its most extreme sense. For most of the Cold War, the USSR had 15 such republics, countries that we all know and love today. Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. Growing out of the unrest following the Russian Revolution in 1917, although unrest puts it very mildly, The Soviet Union was officially established in 1922, but that didn't put an end to the troubles that plagued the nation. In a very quick and admittedly brutal period, basically the following 20 years, it became a major world power, with its goal of communism standing in sharp contrast to Western capitalism. Real quick, let's consider the major differences between capitalism and communism. Capitalism is something many of us know, having grown up with it. But simply put, it's a system that allows and even demands for individuals to control industry and trade for personal profit. Seeing its origins as far back as people sold stuff to other people for something in return, it's actually been traced back to the 15th century Renaissance period. Back when people wore stuff like this. Respectable. Honestly, I would think that the idea of buy for $1, sell for $2 goes back even further.
It's his property, and he can do almost anything with it that he likes. We needed weenies. Mr. Brown had weenies. It's as simple as that. You might argue about his prices. Anyway, Eleanor did. But after all, he has a right to earn something for the goods and services he supplies.
Buy for $1, sell for $2.
We needed weenies.
There are particular moments in history, like the Industrial Revolution or the creation of global stock exchanges, that helped to cement capitalism as the dominant global ideology based on making money. Governments can benefit, and clearly do, but initially they were not meant to be overly involved. Capitalism has evolved over time though, and there have been instances where governments have needed to get involved in order to say what they consider to be crucial businesses. But that's really above most of our pay grades. Too big to fail and all that, which really means that if you shove your greedy little fingers into too many pies and eventually eat yourself into a coma, the government has to pay to pump your stomach and give you liposuction, because if you died then it would be too much of a burden on the rest of us. Because of all the pies. I really need to make these kinds of comparisons more for myself than anyone else.
What an
absurd metaphor.
Mark.
Really, there are different components and values that can split and change how we define different capitalist systems, and you can subcategorize until you're blue in the face. But the main tenets are still and making money. However, it's supposed to be the free market that determines value, and prices depend on the concepts of supply and demand. Profit is the name of the game, and if you don't see one, then you're out of here. On the other hand, communism grew out of the socialist considerations seen back even around the French Revolution, but really came to prominence with the publication of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' Communist Manifesto. The whole thing is basically unreadable to me, like it was written in another language or something. What? Oh, it was? Okay, is there like an English version though? Like, it's hard for me. I've been trying to translate it word by word and it's taking forever. Okay, thanks. Oh great, it's still basically unreadable. Okay, so people smarter than me have summarized communism in its final form as pushing for a classless society where there is no money and no government, and really no need for either, as people as a community are the ones that own everything and split up the resources that they have based on merit and need. However, for all that to become possible, there is also the need for violent class warfare, basically the workers against the owners, which happens as a necessity for society to be restructured. At the same time, Marx and Engels didn't really lay out a specific guide on how to get there, but we can see an example of this class warfare in the Russian Revolution in 1917, albeit one that didn't really fit the mold of the Communist Manifesto, since Russia at that point was still a rural farming nation, very far off from the industrial type that was supposedly needed for the revolution to begin. But you can't argue with the results, and Lenin and his gang of Bolsheviks eventually established the Soviet Union after years of bloody warfare. And then we come to another point. Is socialism communism? Are they the same thing? Not exactly. Communism is different from socialism in that socialism allows people to own personal property, as well as governments to control industry. Communism has no personal property, only community property, and eventually no government at all, just councils, which is where Soviet comes from, made up of regular people that dictate the path to follow. There were so many subsets and changes to the idea of communism, such as Marxism-Leninism, which is the one-party system that they practiced in the Soviet Union. They didn't really subscribe to that whole no government view. It's a lot easier to be in charge when there's a dictatorship and no other opinions are allowed. But again, that's only one subset, among many others, mostly named after the person that shifted around the meaning into a stricter definition that worked out the way they wanted to. Like Mao in China, or Tito in Yugoslavia. So within all these definitions is an ideology that is understood differently to different people. This means that the blanket term communism is not universal. Different schools of thought can coexist or even compete. Go figure. However, as I understand it, the Soviet Union never reached communism in its truest sense, in that there was never a time when money and government control stopped existing. There were certainly times when they pushed for it, but eventually they ended up with a few haves and a lot of have-nots. At the same time, I'm going to keep using the term communism, since it lays out the ideological divide in a simpler way than all of the minute details allow. With all those completely and almost comically simplified definitions done with, we can actually look at the Cold War as a whole now. The rise of both the Soviet Union and the United States really deserve a longer look, but I'm running out of time and space here. I mean, technically there's no time limit or space limit, but I mean in terms of my own patience. I'm not trying to recite a textbook here. I'm losing you, I can tell. Before we all fall asleep, let's get it over with. Both the United States and the Soviet Union moved towards becoming a superpower in the midst of World War I. When the US eventually joined, they began to firmly push Britain out as the world's main power, especially by war's end. And by that point, the Russian Revolution was taking place in, well, Russia. After a bloody civil war, the Soviet Union eventually emerged in 1922. From this period until the Second World War, these two countries grew in strength, but their international influence wasn't as highly touted. The United States spent time claiming the need for isolationism, and the Soviet Union was the new kid on the block who had some crazy ideas about sharing and no one really wanted to be their friend.
What a load of commie bull.
But at the same time, and despite the apparent issues in pushing their ideologies abroad, Americans were always on the move during this period, pushing a cultural and economic exchange that they probably didn't even realize they were doing. And the Soviet Union tried their best to be more involved, setting up the Communist International, or the Comintern, to advocate for the international spread of communism. Listen, obviously, it wasn't like it is now, with the world connected by every conceivable technological option. But it was beginning to move in that direction. Actual isolationism is pretty hard to come by.
Children, fingers in your ears and make the la-la sound. La-la 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 la-la.
The two nations were increasingly further apart in terms of their main ideologies, and worries about the evils of the other side, either communist or capitalist, plagued their populations. Although they officially opened diplomatic relations in 1933, keep in mind that's 11 years after the Soviet Union was technically founded. So that doesn't mean that the two sides agreed on very much. And if you're asking yourself why Russia didn't just accept that capitalism was obviously the right way to go, then you don't really have a grasp on how fundamentally different that nation was at the end of the 19th century, and you should be ashamed of your ignorance.
There's no shame in saying you've lost a step. The only shame would be not admitting it until it's too late.
Step off me bruv, you don't know who you messin' with.
Nah, but seriously, it really comes down to an ongoing fear of losing themselves within the craze of an uncaring free market. Even though the Tsar, their version of a king, was losing support at the time, and eventually lost his head, that doesn't necessarily mean an easy transition to a democratically elected government and free market capitalism. There are some guys who would take issue with that. All of my homies hate capitalism. So when World War II started in 1939, the United States and the Soviet Union weren't even involved, with the United States staying neutral and the Soviet Union having a non-aggression pact with Germany. That unsteady peace lasted until 1941, the year when both were attacked. So at this point, even these ideologically opposed nations found allies in one another. Like if, say, a new neighbor moved in, one with some pretty terrible ideas. You know, I'm gonna drop the whole neighbor shtick when it comes to talking about Nazis. Regardless, the US and the Soviet Union put aside their mutual distaste for a while, with the Soviets killing more German troops than any other nation by a large amount, but without forgetting the billions of dollars in military equipment and other resources that the US sent to the USSR. Former rivals turned allies, a beautiful story. That about wraps it up, doesn't it? Well, not really, because of course it doesn't.
In the background was the growing struggle between two great powers to shape the post-war world.
Once their common enemy was defeated, and because conflict is such a natural part of human behavior, the seemingly inevitable clash between capitalism and communism, through their greatest advocate nations, could really begin. And now, a word from our sponsor.
We needed weenies.
It's your
Weenies.
Use it when you need it.
J.G. Wentworth is right. It's mine,
Weenies.
and I need it now.
It's
Weenies.
and I need it now.
It's mine,
Weenies.
and I need it now.
It's
Weenies.
and I need it now.
If you have a structured settlement and you need
weenies,
J.G. Wentworth can help. We'll buy all or part of your structured settlement for
weenies,
so you can pay bills that have piled up as a result or an inability to work.
We needed weenies. 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 It's as simple as that. We needed weenies.
With economics as a major part of each ideology, the pursuit of wealth was another unavoidable factor in choosing a side. How many of your daily worries are about money?
What's true is that in 48 hours, you and I will have more money than God.
Communism did provide an alternative that could actually look pretty good at times. At least considering that it promised money was going to become obsolete. If you lost everything in the 1929 stock market crash and were drowning in the Great Depression that followed, having the option of a job and food on the table was pretty good. Americans did go to the Soviet Union by the thousands in the 1930s, and they were initially welcomed with open arms. The Soviet Union's battle was with American-led capitalism, not American workers. Of course, that particular brochure didn't include the things that you'd be giving up in return for the hope that one day you might not need to worry about money, like having enough food, for instance. And a lot of the Americans that went over were later persecuted in Stalin's purges, ending up in labor camps or facing a firing squad. And remember, it's easy to judge them all as fools, but how could they know then what we know now? Tisk tisk, so judgmental.
I will accept the judgment of posterity.
So we get it, the economy is super important and affects us all. But it's also an incredibly dense and boring subject, however necessary it is to our modern existence. But as important as the economy is in terms of our lives now, consider it after the Second World War ended in Europe in 1945. I know I jumped ahead after a few important years, but we need to move on. So Europe was physically and economically devastated, beyond the human casualties. And I know those casualties are sad, no doubt, and they deserve their space. But I would think that the survivors would want to keep surviving after the war ended.
Got milk?
So the massive changes that those 6 years of war did to people and their individual livelihoods definitely affected how they saw one ideology or the other. And the options were basically down to those two. Soviet leaders hoped that the economically downtrodden would turn on their leaders, leading to the class warfare that they're always going on about. Capitalist leaders, led by the US, were worried about the same thing, so putting money into the economics of these countries was a way to keep them on their side, basically paying money to them to be their friend. Real-life examples include the 1947 Truman Doctrine, named after the president, which was a public plan to contain the global spread of communism, and the 1948 Marshall Plan, named after the Secretary of State George Marshall, which put billions of dollars, billions in the 1940s, mind you, into stabilizing and modernizing the Western European economy. The long-term goals would allow for growth and continued ties to the US, as well as keeping communism at bay in those regions. This was known as the policy of containment, and it was a pretty important aspect of US foreign policy for years to come. The Soviets naturally viewed anyone accepting US money as an anti-Soviet act, which was basically code for doing anything that they didn't like, and forbade the countries that it now occupied, the ones that the Red Army never left after it pushed into Germany, from taking part. This meant that, on the surface, the Soviets were the ones who instigated the split between East and West, which is one of the intents of the Marshall Plan in the first place. It also facilitated a break between the Soviets and Communist Yugoslavia, who began receiving Western aid money by the late 1940s. In this instance, the West, and especially the United States, had gained the moral high ground, despite the high monetary cost.
The United States was obliged to help Europe safeguard its traditional freedoms and the independence of its nations.
These kinds of victories, not military but still really important, were paramount in the developing Cold War. Okay, so let's recap. Even though the Cold War is said to have started after the Second World War, there are precedents that reach much farther back. According to the historian Odd Arne Westad, Even though the two nations were diametrically opposed in terms of their economic and political ideologies, they did share in the desire to effect change on an international level, and both grew in their capacities to do so, although the change that they wanted were obviously very different. Okay, I know I threw a lot at you there, also in a relatively short period of time. I wish I could go into more detail about the interwar period, like the Soviet purges or deportations, or the effects of the Wall Street crash or European appeasement. I wish I could go into more detail about everything, but between trying to cover all the stuff that happened and whining about not being able to go into more detail, I'm pretty booked. Oh, and hey, at one point, weren't we looking at a Bond movie?
Yes, I think I got it without the subtitles.
Continued in Part 2.